The focus for this particular interview is on the book side, IFWG, and I certainly I'm looking forward to this completely. We have Richard Harland appearing very shortly. He is the author of the Ferren Trilogy, and the third and final book is turning up in a couple of weeks. That's Ferren and the Invaders of Heaven. I've got a lot to say, a lot to talk about, but it's probably better if we just get straight into it. Hello.
Hello, Gerry.
How are you?
I'm feeling pretty good. It's hot down here as well as it's hot up there, I think.
That's right. So just for the audience, just in case they're in Alaska or someplace like that, I'm in sunny Queensland, although it's not sunny at the moment. And Richard is in New South Wales in the coastal regions.
Just south of Sydney. Yep.
Yep. By the way, I love your hat.
Yeah, well, I mean, for Ferren and the Ferren Trilogy, I really should be wearing wings and a halo, but I couldn't come at that. I didn't think it would go down well. So I'm wearing my steampunk hat that I used to wear when the World Shaker books were having all their success. And, I just felt like giving it another go.
Oh, look, it all slides into the fantasy themes.
Yeah. And there also is an element of steampunk in the Ferren Trilogy itself.
Very much so, and also if you had wings, people wouldn't be able to see them. People wouldn't be able to see them. We're squeezed in anyway. Look, first and foremost, it's an absolute pleasure to have you because I don't get the opportunity too often to either meet face to face or virtually. In this case, our authors, because they're all over the place. But given that your background and what you've done, it is an absolute pleasure, Richard.
It's good to be talking to you in a sort of interview situation for a different time, Gerry.
Yeah, I mean, it gives me the opportunity also to ask questions that maybe, I mean, you and I have been communicating off and on.
We have these long rambling chats, which
That's
probably
right.
we can't afford to do this afternoon, right?
Exactly. But at the same time, I've got some questions, and there's a real opportunity to get answers out of this. But look, I think before we get into sort of the questions and answers proper, maybe it's a good idea if you can give the audience a little bit of an idea of your background, where you come from, that sort of thing.
Well, you can tell by my accent. I mean, when I hear myself on an interview afterwards, my accent is very strongly Suffolk, which is a sort of rural part of England, about 80, 90 miles from London. And although it's near London, it's actually a very pretty sort of countryside that John Constable painted. And that's where I did most of my growing up, and came to Australia almost by accident. I just loved the place when I got here. I loved the sun and the people and everything about Australia. So I ended up living in Australia. But that's how I sort of got into Australia, and how I got into writing. Actually being able to finish writing books is another story entirely.
Look, I get that, and and I suppose that given the background of the types of books that you've written and have gained quite a degree of success, fantasy does appear to be a high level definition that could really encapsulate many of them.
Yeah, as long as you take fantasy in a wide sense that isn't just sort of traditional sword and sorcery type fantasy, because although I love reading those books, it's never been what I want to write. I always want to explore something a bit different, and every one of my books is pushed out in one way or another. And Ferren and the Angel, Ferren and the Doomsday Mission, Ferren and the Invaders of Heaven, we have a different kind of world entirely. It's still fantasy, but it has elements of science fiction, elements of steampunk, elements of horror, and it's a different kettle of fish entirely.
Yeah, I must admit, when I had the pleasure of reading the Ferren Trilogy manuscripts as part of the process of taking you on with our company, I certainly found that one of the strongest elements that really attracted me to those books was the way you orchestrated the mixing of a number of subgenres, if you want to call it that, that are not normally very common in any writing. And you've already gave a bit of a description in terms of the Ferren Trilogy. Certainly, I love the concept of a fantasy interposed with a dystopic type scenario, and a post-apocalyptic type scenario. Wonderful.
But the whole sort of
Mm.
cosmology of angels.
Oh yes,
That's the thing that sort of ties it all together. The idea that in the future, 1,000 years from now, this war has been going on for 1,000 years between the armies of heaven and the armies of earth, and just delving into all that background, all that angelology, all the sort of, I guess I think of it as, well, you know, Tolkien worked from Anglo-Saxon and Norse religions, the mythologies there. Plenty of people have worked from Celtic mythology, but there was this whole area that hasn't been, to me, really deeply explored, which is the lore behind the, well, Judeo-Christian Islamic religions, and in terms of the mythology behind them, they're all pretty much the same. I mean, they might be at loggerheads in the real world at the moment, but in terms of where they come from almost exactly the same place. And it's fascinating. I just love all that stuff. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I don't know, it moves me deeply. I've been told I might be a deathbed convert, so, you know, I think that's where I stand. Emotionally, it does something. Emotionally, it's very, very powerful.
I got the same sense too when I read the original manuscripts, and when I read it, and when we went through the complete production process, I read it again. I think maybe one of the reasons why it hasn't been used much is because it's, I mean, like Norse mythology has already had for a long time a certain degree of public appeal, and hasn't been submerged in any way. It's there. You can grab it, and even in Marvel, you know, they've done their little bit. But interestingly enough, the Judeo-Christian mythology has submerged, maybe sometimes intentionally, because popular religion would look at the more popular elements of their religion rather than the roots of their religion, the esotericism and all those little bits and pieces.
Yeah, well, a lot of the lore is actually in kind of obscure books, not quite orthodox texts like the Apocrypha, the Kabbalah, Gnostic texts. It's not so much in the main stream that's come down to our day, but things that go back a long, long while.
Yeah, and
it's like a hidden treasure chest.
And I think you're right. And I'm so pleased that you're one of the few people who've opened the treasure chest lid from a fiction point of view. So I'm pleased by that. Look. Again, we're getting back to the fantasy, the side of things. And yes, I agree with you, by the way, fantasy in the broader sense. And sometimes I think fantasy is best defined as being what if, but where it's in absolute realistic terms, it can't happen. But what if? And try to make it feel like it can happen, as opposed to science fiction, where I think it's what if and it absolutely could happen is the best type of science fiction. Putting that little rant or little aside, I just mentioned the YA side of it. Why YA? Well,
when I first started writing, I didn't think of myself as a YA writer. I've never really consciously written YA books. I've written fantasies that have turned into YA books, and particularly because of the age of the protagonists, which seems to be the key factor. Ferren and the Angel, which was originally written as a standalone novel, was written for adults in the first place, and it wasn't working very well. There was something that wasn't working about it, and I needed to do a rethink. And one of the things was that people said to me, you know, why isn't this YA? You've got YA protagonists. And one of the things that wasn't working was some of the sort of explicit scenes in it that really weren't needed. And I wasn't handling them very well. And I thought, yeah, what I should do is start from a new starting point and write it as YA. So it's still, in a sense, the same fantasy, the same kind of story that it was, but it just doesn't move into areas that go beyond YA. And I mean, that is the thing about fantasy. You know, the appeal of fantasy doesn't really have age bands. You look at realistic fiction, and the things that you're interested in seeing in realistic fiction when you're 13 years old aren't the same as the things you're interested in seeing when you're 16 years old. Your life has changed in that period. So as you progress through life, you get different interests, and you want to see them reflected in realistic fiction. But fantasy is imagination. It's all about imagination. And in a sense, everyone has the same imagination at every age. Kids don't lack in imagination. They don't have to develop their imagination. It's there in them. And I mean, you know, if you look at the history of how fantasy has appealed, Lord of the Rings, adult, young adult, Harry Potter, young adult, but adult. You know, all of the great works of fantasy have worked across the age bands, just because the appeal of the imagination doesn't have age limits.
Yeah, I would agree with you. In terms of the story, in terms of the characterization, absolutely. I mean, obviously there are some elements that differentiate different age groups, more to do with reading capability, that sort of thing. But you're absolutely right. I should point out, though, I should, just for the audience, just about, maybe you want to say something about it, is that in the United States, YA is I can't give you an exact, but it's for about 15, 16 up, and then middle grade is for the middle school type age group. When I talk about YA, I'm pretty much using the American definition more than I am the Australian definition, where middle grade is incorporated into the YA category. I'm not trying to counter your point, Richard, about the universality, but I mean, like, a 13-year-old, 12-year-old may want a 50,000 word, 40,000 word book. Love interest may not be that much interesting.
Well, you would have said that perhaps before Harry Potter, but
yeah. Oh, yeah. But see, I would argue that Harry Potter started off as middle grade, and the readers grew with the books as they came through.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, middle grade in the American definition really. It doesn't. You start talking about YA when you're talking about 13 upwards, and then you go through YA, and then you come to new adult as a whole separate sort of subsection. So
it's tricky.
Fantasy doesn't belong in any one category. I don't.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, and for that reason, very, very appreciative. But I think we pretty much nailed it as best we could in terms of categorization as a book to publish. I'm pretty sure we got it right, and your points are absolutely valid indeed. We talked about. I'll go back to genres again one more time, because it interests me. We've talked about, like, the classic speculative fiction genres like horror, fantasy, science fiction, and then of course the subgenres and so on and so forth. Given your background and given your writing aptitude, have you dabbled in, or do you want to dabble in what I suppose people could call realistic fiction? You know, where there isn't fantasy involved, right? Or have you thought of it?
I guess there was a time when I had ambitions to write realistic fiction. My period of writer's block, my 25 years of writer's block, when I couldn't ever manage to finish a single novel or story that I started, partly because I was trying to write the wrong kind of stuff. I'm interested in some aspects of realistic fiction. I'm interested in the psychology and the sort of social background that gets involved in realistic fiction, but I'm not particularly interested in doing that as contemporary realistic fiction. And I think it works interestingly in terms of fantasy. Looking at, I mean, you know, if you take Shakespeare as one of the great, I think he is one of the great sort of psychological, insightful people of all time. He didn't work with contemporary Elizabethans and Jacobeans. You don't need to be looking at human beings in terms of contemporary reality to get into the depths of the human psyche. And in terms of societies, I've always been interested in the possibilities of other kinds of societies, which cast light on what makes societies in general, rather than what makes. Well, it's very actually difficult to look at our own society because we're too much in it. In some ways, you need to step outside to see clearly how those things work, how social mores and rituals and so on, how they all develop. And fantasy that's a great advantage of fantasy in a way, in a talking sort of in a serious literary way. But the great advantage of fantasy is that you get a perspective on things that takes you outside of the immediate and the present, and enables you to get a wider, deeper perspective, I think. This I believe.
I 100% support you, and I think there are plenty of examples. If you go to some of the great classics, Alice in Wonderland, for example, on the surface, it's almost like a children's story, but just have to read the annotated Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass to realize that he used that story as a means to insightfully look at the British society at the time, and politics and everything. So I absolutely agree with you. And may I add, the absolute greatest fantasy and science fiction writers, probably more praise for that element than anything else. What you just described. So I 100% support that. Yeah.
At the same time, there is the sheer joy of imaginative world building and telling a very exciting story. And that's, in a sense, my speciality. That's what I had from the very beginning. When I first decided I wanted to be a writer, I had that talent and I lost it along the way. And it took me a long, long while to get back to it. And I think the other further interests kind of come out of that, if you know what I mean. It's if you start off thinking serious themes, serious purposes, no. The thing is, you've got to enthrall the reader first, and then you can have other elements coming in.
I believe Tolkien actually explicitly stated that. When he was asked, for example, the scouring of the Shire, was that your experience in World War One? And his response was, "Well, I may have drawn from it, but in reality, I just wanted to create a great story that was long, that could keep people sustained."
Never look down on story. You have to keep telling people this. Never look down on story. It's so important, and it's not easy to do.
Yeah, no. So you mentioned world building. So that's another topic that interests me, and I'm sure will interest the viewers. It's one thing quite often a standalone fantasy, particularly fantasy novel, but science fiction too. They can sometimes be quite large novels, and the reason why is because you're not throwing the reader into an environment that they're already completely familiar with. They have to know what this new environment is. So here comes the world building, and so therefore,
I mean, with the Ferren Trilogy, the world building started in a curious kind of way. I mean, it's not my only novels that have started like this, but the Ferren Trilogy started off with a dream. And in the dream, I mean, I've always had these really vivid dreams, like watching a movie almost. And I was under a blanket, and I pulled down the blanket a little bit and peeked out up at the night sky. And there in the night sky were these weird sounds and cries and great booming voices and lights flashing on and off and shooting beams of some kind of radiance. And I just knew in my dream, the way that you can know things in dreams, you know, it's almost as if someone has told you. I just knew this is the war going on between the armies of heaven and the armies of earth. And I was there in the dream watching it all, and one particular light suddenly came hurtling down out of the sky and crashed down to the ground nearby. And I just stuck back under the blanket, and coming out of the dream and out of sleep in that sort of semi-drowsy state that you're in, and when you come out of a dream and out of sleep, I thought to myself, that must have been an angel crashing down to the earth. It's been shot down in the war between heaven and earth. And when I came a little bit clearer in my head, I thought, I've been given the start of a novel. That, you know, it just presented to me on a plate. And the Ferren books have had enormous development and gone through enormous numbers of changes. But still, the first 10 pages of the first book, Ferren and the Angel, are pretty much that dream, with Ferren taking my place. But that's how it all started. And because it started in that way, I then had to kind of work out, what sort of world is this? I mean, where does this world come from? How come the armies of heaven are fighting the armies of earth? What does it even mean? And gradually I sort of developed a whole mythology. This is where I started getting I mean, I was previously fascinated by William Blake and Milton and people like that. I mean, I was always a bit interested in that world, but I'd never delved into it much. But now I started delving into it deeply and finding out more and more and incorporating that into a whole vast history and geography that would make sense of my initial dream. And even the blanket bit needed a special kind of explanation, because I, come Ferren, looking up at the night sky, only had a vague idea of what was going on. It was slightly scary, slightly frightening. The feelings I had about this light crashing down close by were fear more than anything else. Where did that all come from? And that was the sort of the generative seed that brought on the whole development of the world. And in a way, that's a good way to work. It's a good way to work when you're telling a novel too, because as everyone knows, the worst thing you could possibly do with world building is you've done so much world building that you just want to info dump it on the reader. Just give out lashings of facts about this world. And because I started out with Ferren's point of view, he knows almost nothing about his world. He has to move out into it gradually. And I moved out into it gradually with him. And the big step that I had to take later down the track was to go from the world as he discovers it in Ferren and the Angel, book 1, into the even bigger situation that develops in book 2 and book 3. The stakes get higher, the world building gets bigger each time. And yes, I was exploring with Ferren, and I hope the reader would enjoy exploring with me.
No, you actually answered a few more questions I wanted to ask. In that answer, I do love it when authors, I write too, but when authors talk about the seed that starts it, and I really believe in the magic of that seed. I really do believe in it. And what's amazing about it is that just like a seed that's rather small can end up in an adult plant that has leaves and flowers and maybe amazing capabilities, that's almost the ratio of what the seed, regardless of what it looks like, can do to a book.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can be lucky or unlucky. I was very lucky in the sense that Ferren, come me, looking up at the night sky, wasn't actually with the armies of earth or the armies of heaven. A bit of a sort of an outsider, sort of a somewhat limited, ignorant outsider. And that enabled me to play things in the trilogy as a whole, which if I'd started out from the idea of just war between the armies of heaven and the armies of earth, I wouldn't have been looking at. So sometimes the seed, well, in many ways in this case, many elements of that original seed and further elements that came in along kept on growing and growing. It just spread out as if it had its own idea of where it needed to get to.
Yeah, fair enough. Actually, I saw it. I just realized when you were saying that there's a bit of a little parallel with what other commentary about YA before, because you said that you wanted to bring it down so that you could get the age, or I suppose the age category of the reader, if you want to call it that, associated with who the protagonist is or the protagonists are, and we're talking about point of view here. And what you're using point of view also in terms of a mechanism for world building, because you're using the point of view of Ferren, and it makes perfect sense to me, because yes, it does circumvent so many pitfalls or challenges that you can face if you write a significant world building oriented book, and I think you got the right magic there. I think it does work. Again, I think that's a kudos.
Right.
I don't think I don't think we need to go much further. We don't want to get the audience to, they need to have time for their coffees and things too. But the last bit about the writing a trilogy or writing a multi-book series. This one interests me as well. I do ask many authors this question, even just from a personal point of view. When you write a standalone, it actually has quite its own challenges. You literally have an end, and you've got this world building that, suffused, built through that. The advantage of having multi-book series is that you can expand the world, and this is what you did do. But at the same time, though, you didn't expand it in a infinite sense. You expanded it in a controlled sense, and this is what I'm interested in. Is there anything else that you can tell me and tell us about your thinking when you plot out, when you build a finite series? Just a few examples of some thoughts that come to mind is that book one can be sometimes quite different from book two and three in the case of a trilogy, because you are initially building the world and introducing the characters. In book two, there's an automatic assumption that people have read book one, so there's a little bit of world building advantage when they slide in. But what are some thoughts of yours on that?
Well, yes, I haven't actually written a trilogy as a trilogy yet. The first set of books that I wrote, the Eden and Vale, 3 books, were, first of all, the first one was written as a standalone, and the second one followed on from that, and the third one followed on from that, but I had to sort of, in a way, continue on from what I already had each time. I didn't plan what was going to happen in the next book. The World Shaker books, World Shaker was written as a standalone, and it was only as when I started being asked to have a sequel to it that I started thinking how I could expand it and develop the world in further ways. The Wolf Kingdom kids books that I wrote are probably the only time that I've written books knowing that I was going to be writing, well, a quadrology in this case, for a quartet of books before I started writing. In some ways that's good for me, because with this long history of writer's block, the thought of writing a whole 3 books would probably daunt me. It would probably, flatten me and make me feel that I couldn't keep going on it. So, starting on one book is at least manageable. The Ferren trilogy started out as one book. The story of Ferren in Ferren and the Angel, I thought of as a complete story, and I didn't really think of anything much beyond then. And it was only when I needed to think of another two books that I had to put my brain to work very quickly and desperately think up some new ideas. And the ideas that I came up with, in the end, proved incredibly fruitful. But they were seeds that needed time to sprout. And it's only with the IFWG versions, Ferren and the Doomsday Mission and Ferren and the Invaders of Heaven, that I feel I've really, I hope, for the first time, created a trilogy that works as a trilogy ought to work, which is getting higher and wider every time, one building on the other, each story complete in itself, but having growth points that leave you open to the next development, and the developments get bigger and bigger. And of course, you know the title of the last book, Ferren and the Invaders of Heaven. That's the ultimate story. The artificial human actually invade heaven, and it's what they've been planning to do all along. They have a way of constructing a tower all the way up to heaven, and Ferren and his followers, who are no longer simply on the side of the earth, they go up to join in the fighting, and they pick a side, and they end up being the crucial factor in the whole ultimate war. So, you know, it gets to the biggest stage imaginable, but I wasn't aware of that at all to begin with.
No, that's fascinating, and yeah, I do personally differentiate between books that were written as standalone, and then there's a sequel, or maybe even a sequel of a sequel, and so forth. You know, it's just a new story almost, if you want to call it that. But of
It
course,
sort
it'll
of
harken.
works differently with fantasy. I mean, with crime, with detective mysteries, you've got the same main characters appearing each time. But other than that, you can have tell a new story each time. Except that more and more crime series now do have some sort of overarching serial killer or whatever who keeps coming back in story after story. But fantasy, you've got to do so much world building just to get started, and then it's easy to lose track of the story, is what I'm saying. It's easy to get deflected by other things that you need to do in fantasy, and to keep the stories moving on and moving bigger each time, because it is a sort of exploration of a world. And, you know, in the very first sequel I wrote, which was the sequel to The Dark Edge in the science fiction series, the Eden and Vale series, having developed one sort of world, which was actually too big for the book, the next one, all I could think to do was to actually narrow it down into a very small world and a very small set of characters. And in a way, what I did was I lost the momentum. I think that's what you need. The momentum needs to go up and up and up. And I think I finally achieved it.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think readers. I mean, sometimes readers' feedback can be very helpful, because at the end of the day, a reader who will read a trilogy, for example, would intuitively want, you know, and need and look for that build up, that crescendo coming. And so the ultimate test is the reader.
Yeah, well, this is where fantasy and science fiction have often had a problem, is that having written one successful book, readers cry out for more, and publishers want to produce more, so the author has to come up with a second book and then a third book, and sometimes they can get better and better, but the trouble is that sometimes also they go on into the stage of just losing inspiration and imagination. You can only keep building for that long, and it has happened with quite a lot of fantasy series that they go on beyond their natural growth point.
Yeah, and we all will know. We'll all have examples in our heads, I'm sure. But look, I think it's probably time to wind up. This has been a fascinating conversation. It covered a lot of different things. It's a bit like our own personal conversations, I think. Um,
Rambling.
Rambling, but interesting. But look, I'm absolutely pleased by what I've heard and what we've talked about. I'm sure that the viewers will as well. I just want to remind everyone that in only a few weeks we've got ourselves the third book coming out. It's a global release in
It's
the
the
English.
26th.
Yeah. It will be a little bit later on books in physical bookstores in Australia and New Zealand, and that's just part of the complication of being in Australia. And while we're an Australian company, guess where our the engine of our production is and distribution? It's in the United States. So sometimes it takes the Pacific is big. So that's what happens. But certainly, if you want ebooks, it'll be available. And I'm sure that there are already many people who want to grasp the third book and then complete the crescendo of the storyline. But
I hope so.
yeah, I'll flash a
I'm
few
highly
things at the end.
confident.
Yeah, I'll flash one or two QR codes and put in the comments a few things too, so people can search and find more easily if they're interested in Ferren and the Angel, or for that matter, anything that Richard Harland has written. So thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. Oh, it just
And
seems strange saying thank you, Gerry, because we know each other. So,
yeah,
anyway,
oh, that's fine, but we don't normally do interviews, do we?
we don't.
So.
No, this is different.
I've been looking all this time, and none of the cogs on your hat have turned. Uh,
Hmm.
no, it doesn't
I
matter.
should send it back.
All right. On that note, thank you very much, everyone. And like I said, enjoy the Ferren Trilogy, and particularly the latest book, Ferren and the Invaders of Heaven. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. It's been fun.